Hello world! Curses of madness be upon you all, my friends. I am Euclidean Vision, the emotional support, back with the second part of a video about Null Sector units for Overwatch 2. And in the first part, I went through all the units that we've seen in the games thus far, and in the concept art that has been released for Overwatch 2. And thus far, everything we've seen doesn't really interest me too much, because it's all just sort of a few various ways of dealing damage. My last video went through ways to improve the existing units, and now I'm just going to spiel off a bunch of ideas for new Null Sector units that I've thought of, and to give you some sort of related examples of how they could work mechanically. So, as we know, Null Sector, bunch of robot dudes. Let's play with that and just go with all the sorts of ideas that we can. The first thing I sort of thought of was what I call the Null Brawler, which is a mobile, melee-focused unit that I had the idea of them using sort of a Zangief spin with their arms spinning around their torso on like an axis to sort of deal damage and knockback. They could stick their hands into the floor to stretch themselves back for a massive sort of dive launch, sort of like Zac from League of Legends, and they could also have a hand that stretches out afar, grabs you like a hook, and they could obviously have a big beefy Blitzcrank Doomfist uppercut. I didn't say this at the beginning. The Null Brawlers I see sort of looking like Blitzcrank with maybe small bottoms but really overstated upper bodies and really big metal hands for punching people. And then we could go totally the other way with a unit I call the Null Hopper, which would sort of look like a giant metallic grasshopper and would be focused again with a lot of melee damage and being incredibly mobile, but maybe a bit less brawly than the Null Brawlers, and sort of using a bit more finesse, sort of using wall jumps, dashes, maybe like individual spin kicks, multi-kicks, sort of like Chun-Li, or you could maybe have like a double foot kick that knocks you back into a wall like a Doomfist punch. I mean, who said that they had to have 2 legs? Let's give them 4 at least, and make them more mobile and able to attack more while moving, or maybe that's just at higher levels, who knows. Yeah, the Null Hopper, take the grasshoppers from Bug's Life, make them robots and make them really angry. And so, keeping up with my animalistic theme, a unit I call the Null Mole, which is probably about as obvious as it sounds. It's a giant mole. It's like Excadrill crossed with like a Big Daddy suit. So drill hands, maybe like a big spiked head when it like burrows into the ground to avoid damage. It can damage you as it dashes past. It could also have sort of like a drill dash like from Bioshock 2. It could obviously have some melee combos like I mentioned in the previous video with various units like the Behemoth. You could maybe build them up into having combinations of just regular melee hits that then build into abilities. Say like smashing the drills into the ground, churns the earth in front of it to make sort of physical cover. And going more with my sort of burrowy, creepy, crawly sort of vibe, the Null Centipede. Totally not something I've tried to make a hero concept out of. Totally. Ignore this one. Don't remember this. It'll never come up again, honestly. I really liked playing Rek'Sai for a while, years back when I played League a lot more. You could have sort of an antlion snare where they sort of lay an area in the ground where if you walk over it, it's going to trap you in place. That could also have some sort of knock-up. You could have it shooting acid, making sandstorms that maybe like destroy your projectiles. Again, you could have where it burrows in the ground, it churns the earth and sort of slows your progress or sort of impedes you entirely from being able to pass through certain areas. You could have it coil up into a dome that becomes physical cover. You could have its segments break off into like little mines, or to become like health pickups for itself, like if you damage it and you break off segments of the centipede, but the centipede manages to get to that broken off piece and pick it back up, it regains health. Or man, you could do so much. Like, I really like the centipede idea. It's never gonna come up again, shut up. So as we move on swiftly to a unit I keep bringing up quite a lot, a translation of Recluse. I'm not even going to fuck around and like lie to you or beat around the bush about this. Some kind of rework of their Recluse idea to the Null Arachnid, or some other more imaginative name. You could have it working maybe sort of more like Elise as well from League of Legends. There's maybe focused more on the actual like spider webs and mobility of a spider, and then different sort of spells, like projectiles that root people in place, things like this. But they both sort of focus on the maybe two different stances of humanoid and spidery, little spiderling minds, and obviously Recluse has got her crazy mouth beam, and if we can get some sort of sexy robo shape-shifting arachnid lady robot for no reason whatsoever, I'd be down with that. Yeah, I think that'd be really cool. I think it'd be really fun to fight against. Which leads me onto a unit that probably won't be all that fun to fight against, but I think it at least promotes priorities in players to make them achieve different objectives. A unit I call the Null Hive, which would be like a stationary unit which creates like a cloud of nanobots. The nanobots themselves you can't damage, but they deal sort of low area of effect damage over like an area, and you have to find the hive and destroy the hive to sort of stop that sort of biting, annoying damage. So yeah, it's really just about priorities at that point. But that leads me on to one of my more favourite ideas, the Null Nano-Swarm or the Ferro-Fluid Sentience. Using, say, the Ferro-Fluid from Oasis or a cloud of nanobots, you could have a fully shape-shifting, does whatever you want it to do mass of matter. Like, the Ferro-Fluid is almost perfect for manipulating both its physical form to form like hard iron, liquid iron, pellets of iron, so like a shotgun. It can turn itself into a shotgun, and it can also like transmit electricity. It could possibly transmit magnetism, like injecting a god program, for instance, into the Ferro-Fluid. That could give you, this really cool unit of essentially infinite possibilities. It can turn itself into physical weapons as hard iron. It could work like Terminator 2. It could work like the T-1000, turning into, obviously, as I say, physical things. It could impersonate other units. It could pretend to be pieces of the map. Like, it could do all sorts of things. When it turns into a sort of nano cloud, or just like acting as the Ferro-Fluid, it can maybe pass through gaps, so it's an enemy you fight progressively throughout a level. When you damage it to a certain point, it escapes down a drain, and then you're not able to damage it again until a later encounter. Various things like that. Like, yeah, the unit of infinite possibilities. Throw your possibilities at it. As I mentioned in the last video, there's a shape-shifting shadow wolf panther in Devil May Cry, in the Devil May Cry series, called Shadow, that has some various attacks that you could take some ideas from and sort of translate into Overwatch 2, I reckon, pretty easily. And so then, to do something that does exist in Overwatch and doesn't, and sort of tie them all into one unit idea, something I call the Null Ghost, which would be a sneak attacker using thermoptic camouflage that allows them to get like particular maybe sneak attacks on you, or if they attack you from behind, it either deals more damage or it enacts a certain effect like a poison or a root, or they start to drag you away. But then this kind of unit, I think you could make quite a bit more supportive as well with something that doesn't yet exist in Overwatch but does in some other games, visual clones. I think even though as a PvE unit it's going to be relatively easy to determine which is a clone and which is a real thing, the similarities will be closer between two AI beings than a human and an AI visual clone. And you could have this unit maybe like phasing through other units and making copies of them, so it becomes really difficult to tell what you're actually meant to be shooting at, so you could just sort of be wasting your time. It's almost like a pseudo tank. Like, yeah, I think that could actually be pretty interesting to fight against. It might be a little annoying, but again, that's kind of the point. Like, the enemy units are meant to be making your life difficult. Like, there is at least counterplay in keeping track, or just, you know, being good enough to kill everything. The visual clones theoretically wouldn't damage you, unless maybe at higher levels, null ghosts are able to just copy units they phase through. That'd be pretty funky. Like, I don't know, let's wait and see what happens. Like, hero missions and ultimate difficulties and stuff could see new interesting mechanics of their own, where we do see some crazy shit go down like that. But that all remains to be seen. I don't work at Blizzard, don't listen to me. So on to something a bit more familiar, something I call the Null Shocker. And this will sort of be just your classic Tesla user. You could maybe even make it a bit more like Shocker from Spider-Man, with actual like physical pulses like Lucio's boops, and then like shooting electricity around them, either sort of like Winston in sort of a directional cone, or you can make it more like a lightning beam, or you could make it sort of like Blitzcrank again with sort of the AoE lightning, or Cannon, same sort of thing, a big AoE like lightning thing, or maybe make it like do like lightning strikes. So it's attacks from above that are initiated from a certain place. In my previous video I mentioned like artillery strikes, marking areas on the ground where incoming fire will be. And just to prove that I made this list in not the most particular order, something I consider quite important and I've mentioned in my previous video, Omnics from factions originally outside Null Sector, with a unit I called the Null Cultist, which would be a Shambali healer unit. Now, I think these would be pretty rare, but I think they'd be pretty cool to come up against, and could give us some insight into the Shambali from a lore standpoint, as well as just providing a new, different enemy to fight, which could just be like a reinterpretation of Zenyatta. But as it wouldn't be likely for there to be many of them, you could give each of the very few quite a particular weapon each, sort of something comparable as a religious symbol to Zenyatta's orbs. And each of those weapons could potentially have their own different projectile attacks or different patterns. And as I brought up the allied units of Null Sector, I will quickly just re-reference the Gwishin that I brought up in my previous video, that these sort of Sentinel drones would be really interesting to see tied in with Null Sector, whether with their original design or sort of respect to be very particularly as a part of Null Sector. But something I'd sort of forgotten about that I think would be really interesting to see as sort of an element the Gwishin bring to the table would be their overridden MEKA drones from before the real creation of the MEKA squad, when the Gwishin took out MEKA's drones by just overriding their controls. That's why they need human pilots now. So if the Gwishin had just repurposed those into their own new particular fighting force, that'd be really interesting lore reveal and quite an interesting like unit to fight, like something similar to D.Va but that's been corrupted by the writhing tentacles and blinking eyes of the Gwishin. With the Gwishin being mentioned, and as I brought up the Null Sector Titan in the last video, it would be pretty cool to have a mission where you play as the MEKA squad and you have to fight the Kaiju Gwishin, like the big bad, the thing that I think is the Omnium. Like, that'd be fucking cool. I think that'd be an amazing boss fight. Again, you'd want to make it like the Titan. As I talked about in my previous video, you would want these sort of boss fights to be more like missions in themselves, like multi-stage objectives to complete, as opposed to, here is a screen-filling enemy that is hard to fight, kill it. You could maybe have a boss that's like that at some point. The Gwishin Kaiju, I don't know. That seems like something you'd have to like think about how you fight that. So, back to my actual ideas for original units, with the Null Maestro. Thinking of MEKA Squad sort of reminded me of Overlord and his drones. So the Null Maestro is a humanoid Omnic unit, maybe sort of robed, similar to the Sage that I brought up in the last video. Maybe looks a bit more like the Wraith, a bit thinner, like I can see it looking sort of like Jafar, but a robot. And floating behind it would be sort of like 4 floating drones, similar to the Orbiters. And these drones would work as sort of rapid-fire guns that are controlled by the Maestro, the one in the middle. You could almost think of them as like playing cards, and he's like a magician throwing around his spectacular attacks. But then these drones, wherever they go, whatever they're actually doing, normally as sort of shooty drones, you could have them as the corners of a barrier, like Sigma's barrier, held between these 4 floating points. Or you could have the drones be dedicated to fixing allies. So the Maestro would be sort of an alternative to the Shaman, Sage, whichever I've designated that unit as, in that it's sort of like a supportive unit, and especially if you make the drones part of a barrier, you could make this sort of an ability-focused tank unit. And then sort of thinking of drones, I'd like to see some sort of twist on Snowball, in a way, but I can see that working a bit more sort of like multiple little snowballs that shoot permanent lasers downwards from their body, and they fly sort of at right angles to each other, so you're sort of dodging through laser grids. I think that could be pretty interesting. It would at least change how you play, and even if the drones themselves aren't that interactive, if it is just this one sort of directional attack, dodge through these things or kill the drone, while that's not too like engaging in itself, I think if there's a fight going on alongside, it can really change how you'd be fighting and where you have to position yourself. I think that would just be really fun. But then on to something similar, a pair of Omnics, like a pair of sort of small drone Omnics, I think would be quite interesting here to use in sort of like a lightning chain facility where the two parts line up, stay still, and they initiate a lightning chain between them. Or you could make them sort of work like a magnetic pair, that you're always repulsed from one and attracted to the other when they're in certain positions, or they could activate magnetic field sort of effects, sort of like maybe gravitic flux, or defense matrix, kinetic grasp. These I can see being very particularly sort of like supportive units, but then if you kill one of the pair, sort of like the Oblobble from Hollow Knight, the remainder of the two could then go into sort of a berserk state, either emitting loads of lightning, flying around, shooting lightning to positions, and then teleporting to the other end of the lightning beam, or disappearing into like a black hole or something. I don't know, I'm just waffling at that point. But something ridiculous that shows almost like its pain at losing its pair, like the thing that it was sort of made to exist with. You know, it's just like an interesting character thing there, and a fun and then kind of scary unit to come up against. Yeah, I think that'd be really fun. And then to maybe break it down a bit further again, I'm not sure, a unit called the Null Spinner. And imagine a big spinning top, but it's Russian dolls. Omnics, or maybe you could have them look sort of like ballerinas that start off as one big Omnic, and the more you damage them, they break down into smaller versions of the same thing that then have rapid, more sort of bouncing off the walls style attacks. If anyone played American McGee's Alice using the jacks, how those would attack once you threw them on the floor. They would sort of auto attack, but they had these really crazy, erratic ricochet patterns. It looked really cool. Like, it looked really cool to use. An enemy that's sort of a scaled up, humanoid-ish version of that. There's a character from Hunter x Hunter that uses a technique very similar, where he controls spinning tops, but he's also able to sort of be a spinning top himself. And while these would largely sort of be mobility, melee focused units, you could also play with them in the way of sort of causing various kinds of CC, like knockback, or maybe even like immobilizing, like drilling someone into the floor when you break them down into their smaller components. So as you fight the Null Spinner, the engagement with it changes. I think that could be pretty interesting. Then a unit that's again sort of more like the Null Hive that I mentioned earlier. It's a unit that produces units. Something I've just called the Spider Egg. And it could hatch potentially like various small Omnics. So it'd be a particular unit that floats around or sort of appears in a place or drops out of the sky. And it, while it exists on the field, possibly with its quite large health pool, it will produce varying Omnics of like a small size, so like slicers, skirmishers, orbiters, the little snowball laser turrets I mentioned, potentially the lightning chain magnetic field pair that I mentioned, though you could have them spawning out of there as well. And you could even go up to the Nano-Swarm, or the Ferro-Fluid infinite possibility creature. But that then is sort of just like an amped up version of the Null Hive, which is a very particular unit. This unit would be spawning other units. You'd have to give that loads of health to make it even a problem. Do you know what I mean? Like, for it to actually take up your time. But it would add variety and sort of diversity to every experience that it's engaged in. It would be a priority target, but it'd be interesting to keep it around to see what it throws out. It could even turn into, say, a Null Arachnid if you leave it alone long enough, something like that, as I called it, the Spider Egg. But then looking actually back to Bioshock, with a unit I call the Null Elementalist, and you can imagine what this does. It's an Elementalist, duh! I imagine this unit basically just playing with a variety of elemental sprays. You can probably keep the spray relatively the same, range, size, etc., regardless of element, but each element would do a different thing. So a flamethrower sets you on fire, does damage over time. Ice Beam, freezes you eventually. Maybe make it less annoying than I don't care, I anticipated this. So to maybe be equally as annoying, we could make it Electricity, which like builds up to a stun over time, something like that. If you get zapped long enough, you get stunned. Or you could maybe make it Water, so it's just permanently knocking you back every tick, like high pressure water. The Elementalist, would be cool from sort of maybe like a design standpoint. It may not be the most fun thing to fight against, but again, if it's trying to kill you, it probably shouldn't be all that fun. Like, yes, it could maybe use some more counterplay, but as there's healing, as there's barriers and stuff in the game, these statuses can be mitigated in their own ways. If you've got a better element to bring to the fore, fucking say, definitely. If we can add elements to this to make it potentially less frustrating, that's not like a bad thing. And so on to my next idea that was sort of the basis for a hero concept at one point, but it was really dumb, but that I think kind of works as an enemy unit, something I call the Null Singularity. And these would be like multiple blank humanoid bodies, or very average standard robot bodies, but they all have a shared health pool, and they'd work almost like the zombie film where they're almost like one giant flowing wave or organism. Like a bunch of humanoid robots that sort of almost band and push together as one that protect sort of a core. Could be kind of interesting. Could have various applications. Make it sort of like Naruto clones, like sacrificing its own health to throw blank bodies at you with other bodies. It could just be there to serve as like a body block tank, like a health sink, like a life link sort of thing again. Yeah, I think there's a few ways you could take it. I think you could even sort of like step that up to something like a null virus that is almost like an entity that's almost like a status effect. You'll be fighting a group of Null Sector, and one of them sort of gets this crazy digital glow, digital style, if you will. While a Null Sector unit is possessed with digital style, it either gains new abilities, or it just gets like a bunch of stat boosts, it gets healed, etc, etc. If it is then killed, or if it survives long enough, or if it deals damage, or a number of different requirements could restrict this from happening, but once those requirements have been met, the virus could then spread to another unit. And you would then potentially have to kill all of the units and isolate the virus, and then when you kill the last unit that had the virus in it, you maybe fight a special virus enemy. There's various ways I think you could play with that. I think it would be really interesting. You're playing with a bunch of crazy robots going to war with humans. There's so many things you can do with these things. Like, give us the energy blade wielding OR-14s from Honor and Glory, please. Give him a charge move, give him a laser slice, give him a ranged laser slice beam, give him like a gallop or sort of like a bucking move where they can knock you back with their hooves. Like, fucking do it. Like, that'd be great, man. I'd love to see that. Like, what about a Null Triforce? Sort of like a central energy, like an omnic core with 3 giant solid floating limbs. Think sort of like Vel'Koz, like a giant eye with tentacles, or I'm sure there's bosses from, what's it called, the Surge, that look kind of similar to this. Like, I'm not sure exactly, I'll try and find an image. But you could give them some crazy like melee spin attacks, or turn those 3 limbs into like physical barriers. You could have them do some ridiculous energy beams and stuff from their giant omnic eye core thing. Like, this could be like the guardian of the iris or something like this. It'd be this big floating omnic energy core that has its own sentience and exists as close to like pure energy as a physical thing can. That's pretty interesting, actually. But with that, that's all the ideas I've had for new Null Sector units. Like, as you can see, they're not all perfect, definitely. They could all use some work. But I think there's some ideas there that could really improve how engaging the missions feel to play. Just giving the AI units more than just damage, or more interesting ways of dealing damage, I think will be of huge benefit to Overwatch 2. And I hope to see the missions develop in the future to include more actual interesting gameplay decisions. But with that, that's all from me for today regarding Null Sector and Overwatch 2 enemy units. Hope to see you in the next one, where we'll be discussing Talon, its existing units, and new units that we could add in to bolster their ranks, but that's for next time. Thanks for staying with me to this point, guys. I really hope you enjoyed the video. Please do all the YouTube things, it really does help out small channels like this one. I've been Euclidean Vision, the emotional support. Take care of yourselves out there, teammates, and may the glorious light of Best Girl shine within you. Bye bye.